Keys scrape in the tower. A silk canopy droops. A clerk notes the hour. 17 days begin to grind, turning coronation rooms into instruments of disciplined despair. Courtiers whisper procedures, not evidence, as officials convert worry into certainty with practiced speed. A foreign executioner is summoned early, the verdict traveling faster than testimony or counsel. What does a borrowed blade reveal about a kingdom's confidence in its own courts? Scripts replace scrutiny, and empathy becomes a liability, trimmed to fit ceremonial time. The language is gentle, the logistics ruthless, and the schedule mercilessly precise to the minute. Four attendants become warders, prayers become reports, private pauses become proof of guilt. A brief editorial note: we avoid lurid reinvention, foregrounding sources, timelines, and institutional design. When theaters of justice reward speed, truth suffocates under choreography that flatters power. The near consequence is immediate. Trust thins, and fear teaches witnesses to remember strategically. Diplomats sense choreography, merchants price uncertainty, and rumor acquires uniforms before dawn. To read clearly, follow the machinery, commissions, couriers, panels, and the measured cruelty of delay. 17 days are not an accident. They are a design optimized for silence. This story is not about monstrosity. It is about method, incentives, and administrative theater. If we misread theater as justice, we will misread the choices that followed. Bridge. Begin at Greenwich, where a gesture on festival stands metastasized into an overnight arrest. Greenwich sparkled with tilt-yard pageantry while courtiers traded glances that doubled as correspondence. A handkerchief flicked, a smile lingered, and whispers sprinted faster than riders changing horses. Within 24 hours, warrants stirred, doors closed, a queen's calendar turned into prosecutorial exhibit. How plausible is an indictment assembled overnight across dates the archives place in other towns? Chronology matters because geography refuses flattery. Richmond cannot be Greenwich by sheer accusation. Clerks copied claims onto neat parchment, but travel logs and duty rosters told colder stories. A brief editorial note: in cases like this, timelines are arguments wearing numbers. Speed, not certainty, led events. Speed for closed counsel, witnesses, and the patient work of contradiction. The near consequence was narrative dominance. Pamphlets framed conclusions while evidence still queued for inspection. Officials favored the headline of decisiveness, mistaking velocity for virtue and paperwork for proof. Gossip, once entertainment, hardened into scaffolding on which panelists could safely hang condemnation. Citizens learned an old lesson anew. When the crown hurries, the truth limps. We therefore track more than rumor. We test where statements collide with dated ledgers. Only then can we see who benefited from a clock that ran unusually fast. Bridge. Moved to the commission signed in late April, where process bowed to a predetermined end. The charge sheet sketched trysts across weeks when court records placed the queen elsewhere entirely. Attendance lists, wardrobe tallies, and travel logs contradict scenes later rehearsed as courtroom certainties. How does Richmond become Greenwich by decree, or a progress halt morph into clandestine encounters? Clerks kept fussy books because stipends depended on presence. Those books now undercut prosecution poetry. Courtiers swore dates with theatrical confidence while the exchequer's ledgers hummed a cooler melody. A careful reader learns quickly that chronology is not scenery, it is the stage itself. When time and place refuse cooperation, motive starts to glow through the cracks left behind. Ambassadors noticed the seams, reporting that allegations ran faster than the horses could plausibly run. Even sympathetic observers muttered that arithmetic seemed pliable, especially where jealousy paid the scribes. The near consequence was paradoxical. Weakness in evidence did not slow momentum. It advertised resolve. Panels read inconsistency as proof of audacity, a trick that flatters power while strangling doubt. Citizens, sensing hurry, read danger. Defendants, sensing choreography, learned silence was safer than precision. Timelines are cross-examinations printed in numbers, and here the numbers asked unwelcome questions. Those questions deserved hearing under counsel, not pamphlets, but the hourglass already ruled proceedings. Bridge, follow that hourglass to late April, when a royal signature shrank process into destination. Before arrests matured into arguments, a commission stamped the case with authority and an ending. Language empowered ministers to bring the matter to an end, not to weigh competing explanations. What happens to justice when mandates specify the finish before investigators test the path there? Bureaucracy obeyed tone, couriers moved, clerks sharpened quills, courtiers rehearsed gravity for public effect. Cromwell's network organized panels, witnesses, and venues as if scheduling a festival with darker music. The paperwork prized closure over clarity, and administrative virtue disastrously misapplied to criminal truth. A brief editorial note: instruments designed for speed and finance rarely suit the anatomy of guilt. Once the seal impressed wax, incentives aligned toward confirmations, not discoveries that might embarrass sponsors. Dissenters faced the old dilemma: raise doubts early and be accused of disloyal evasion. The near consequence was inevitable. Inquiry narrowed, vocabulary hardened, and mercy became a rumor, not policy. Even capable jurists worked inside a maze whose exit was labeled long before entry began. Citizens read decisiveness, defendants read destination. Both impressions, sadly, were accurate in their separate ways. History often confuses confidence with competence. This episode illustrates how the former devours the latter. With process bent toward verdict, only one ingredient remained to clinch a narrative of treason: bridge. Enter a musician named Mark Smeaton, whose confession would supply the tidy confession bureaucracy craved. Mark Smeaton entered history carrying a lute and the least protection rank can offer. Interrogators prized him because commoners rarely enjoy patrons fierce enough to contest procedure. He was questioned, isolated, and presented to the record with a tidy confession. What value has truth when pain and promise can manufacture words convenient to power? Nobles named alongside him refused to confess, a difference courts later framed as arrogance. That contrast mattered because it exposed class arithmetic embedded inside Tudor performances of justice. Confession became centerpiece, not because it was reliable, but because it was administratively efficient. A calm aside belongs here. Coerced speech is evidence of pressure, not necessarily of guilt. Jurors received the package they expected: dates, names, and a storyline capable of carrying condemnation. The near consequence was acceleration. Once words aligned on parchment, momentum outpaced scrutiny everywhere. Diplomats sensed choreography, citizens sensed danger, counsel sensed futility under timetables dressed as fairness. Even sympathetic officials whispered that procedure had surrendered to expedience, and conscience would pay. Weak cases become strong spectacles when confession, not verification, is the coin of the realm. That exchange cheapens law, teaching rulers to buy speed with fear and retrospective ceremony. The musician's name shrank to a footnote, while the machinery grew bolder from practice. Bridge. Watch how that machinery moved the queen into apartments meant for celebration, now repurposed for despair. The tower offered no dungeon to dramatize guilt. Instead, it offered coronation chambers with guards. Silk and stone collaborated to confuse the senses, dignified rooms supervising a captive queen. 4 attendants hovered as companions and note-takers, their kindness braided uncomfortably with surveillance duties. Can comfort become a sharper instrument than chains when privacy itself is the first deprivation? The lieutenant kept civil records, meals, prayers, visitors, while courtiers circulated interpretations like weather bulletins. Delay functioned as leverage. Calendars slipped by hours, and hope rose only to be managed. That management mattered because uncertainty extracts confessions of mood that pamphleteers later translate into motive. A sober aside: architecture can wound quietly when familiar thresholds become checkpoints and sanctuaries become stages. The near consequence unfolded nightly. Sleep thinned, anticipation thickened, and ordinary gestures attracted treasonous readings. Observers praised composure while also cataloging tears, shaping a script where any emotion confirmed guilt. Reports drifted outward, cleaning details for distance and assigning meanings the speaker never intended. The building itself testified against her, since rooms selected for honor now implied a ceremonial fall. Citizens misunderstood plush surroundings as mercy, unaware that velvet can muffle cries and clocks. Gentle surfaces hide harsh truths. The choreography prized visibility over humanity and symbolism over solace. Each postponed hearing promised relief while extending exhaustion, a measured cruelty disguised as administrative prudence. Bridge. Step into the courtroom, where selected peers and polished charges completed a verdict written in advance. 4 appointed ladies attended her constantly, stitching companionship to surveillance with practiced ease. Their diaries translated sighs into signals and ordinary gestures into usable fragments of narrative. Can kindness serve as custody when every courtesy doubles as an instrument of control? Conversation was encouraged, then harvested, because unscripted remarks travel further than guarded silence ever could. The attendants reported prayers, dreams, and doubts, details pliable enough for partisan interpretation. Officials requested examinations intended to clear suspicion, procedures framed as mercy rather than authority. A sober note belongs here. Consent withers when options shrink to acquiescence or suspicion. The lieutenant compiled schedules like weather charts, predicting outlooks from moods, not from material evidence. Courtiers read those charts eagerly, searching for confirmations their briefs had already promised sponsors. The near consequence was chillingly simple. Privacy dissolved, and dignity became conditional on performance. Under such terms, composure looked calculated, and tears looked tactical, whichever outcome power preferred. Citizens mistook plush surroundings for lenience, never seeing paperwork sharpened by each recorded breath. Architecture amplified the script. Doors opened on cue, and footsteps announced rehearsed turning points. Surveillance changed from precaution to proof, since records created the appearance of accumulating facts. Once ordinary life becomes exhibit, neutrality dies, and meaning bows to predetermined narrative. That logic trapped everyone, even witnesses who learned to speak safely rather than honestly. Bridge. The clock now takes over, as carefully timed postponements stretch hope until it breaks. Morning arrived with rumors of reprieve. Evening left with new instructions and rearranged schedules. Messages drifted through guarded doors, promising tomorrow, then shifting tomorrow one measured step away. What purpose does mercy serve when its timetable becomes the sharpest tool in the room? Officials cited logistics, weather, and protocol, while couriers rehearsed sentences meant to calm. Each delay recharged dread, inviting rehearsals of farewell that never found their cue. The foreign executioner lingered nearby, an imported symbol waiting to end a domestic spectacle. Courtiers called the method humane, though its greatest effect was psychological rather than surgical. Gentle phrasing could not hide arithmetic calibrated to drain resolve while preserving ceremony. The lieutenant noted calm behavior, then attributed stillness to acceptance, a tidy administrative conclusion. Near consequence followed quickly. Witnesses adjusted stories to match the schedule's implied moral arc. Merchants predicted closure, pamphleteers drafted eulogies, and ministers congratulated decisiveness masquerading as patience. Delay became destiny, teaching bystanders that procedure outweighs doubt and velocity impersonates virtue. The Queen's composure read, as confession to some, resilience to others, theater to most. A candid aside helps here. Hope weaponized is despair by installments, carefully invoiced. When audiences anticipate an ending, scrutiny softens. Ritual acquires the gravity of inevitability. That gravity soon shifted rooms, as law donned robes and peers took their benches. Bridge, enter the courtroom, where a jury of adversaries and polished charges complete the script. Peers entered in velvet. Verdicts traveled ahead of them like silent, well-briefed ushers. The presiding noble projected gravity, though his kinship and politics glowed through ceremonial restraint. Seats filled with adversaries chosen less for judgment than for predictable, loyal choreography. What chance has fairness when a panel is curated to confirm, not to question? Charges unfolded as theater, confident narration, practiced pauses, and gestures calibrated for watching courtiers. The prosecutor stitched insinuation to certainty, trusting that confidence would substitute for contradiction. Spectators learned quickly which reactions were safe and which expressions might invite whispered reports. A brief aside matters. Trials require both adversarial testing and independence to mean anything substantial. Here, independence bent to proximity, adversarial testing bent to etiquette and the Crown's timetable. The near consequence was psychological. Doubt looked like disloyalty, and hesitation sounded like complicity. Jurors performed decisiveness, signaling unity while discouraging any peer from requesting clarification or delay. By afternoon, the script had tightened. By evening, the audience recognized its assigned lines. A courtroom that flatters power teaches subjects to confuse solemnity with justice and volume with proof. Outside, couriers saddled their horses, prepared to carry certainty faster than facts could travel. Bridge. That certainty deepened when counsel vanished. Witnesses stayed on paper and numbers did the speaking. No advocate rose in defense. The rules allowed none, an absence heavy as chains. Live witnesses rarely appeared. Parchment stood in, neat signatures replacing questions that unsettle narratives. How does truth breathe when cross-examination is replaced by summaries with convenient, durable phrasing? The clerk read statements smoothly, while opportunities to probe memory or motive quietly evaporated. Written testimony traveled well, precisely because it could not be interrupted, amended, or cross-checked. Jurors nodded to rhythm more than reason, encouraged by ceremony to value smoothness over substance. A candid aside helps. Process protects the weak. Shortcuts protect the powerful from embarrassment. Without counsel, silence masqueraded as concession. Without witnesses, conjecture masqueraded as corroboration. The near consequence was arithmetic. 27 votes aligned, impressive in symmetry, hollow in scrutiny. Spectators mistook unanimity for certainty, forgetting that selection bias can harmonize any choir. Merchants marked ledgers, predicting closure. Diplomats adjusted tone, praising order while noting procedural anemia. The message to future defendants was unmistakable. Outpace evidence, and contradiction suffocates under paperwork. A state that prizes velocity will eventually confuse efficient scheduling with moral authority. That confusion lingered like incense, perfuming harsh outcomes with phrases about peace and necessity. Bridge. From judgment, we turn to method, where a foreign executioner becomes policy wrapped as mercy. The crown imported a swordsman from Calais, calling the choice humane and appropriately dignified. The announcement traveled early, becoming part of the script rather than a humane afterthought. What message is sent when compassion is outsourced, scheduled, and advertised as a public virtue? Courtiers praised refinement, contrasting clean steel with older punishments that courted spectacle through lingering pain. Yet refinement, repeated often enough, hardens into theater that flatters power and numbs witnesses. A calm aside helps here. Methods can be gentler while motives remain ruthlessly instrumental. The foreign blade served two audiences, continental critics asking for civility and locals demanding certainty. It promised swiftness, but its early arrival lengthened dread, a paradox officials treated as prudent. By foregrounding technique, ministers shifted attention from evidence toward choreography, a safer battlefield for rhetoric. Near consequence followed quickly. Debate centered on optics, not proof, easing doubts about the investigation's foundations. Merchants priced closure. Pamphleteers rehearsed language about mercy. Diplomats prepared cautious compliments for decisiveness. Citizens learned again that etiquette can perfume violence, and procedure can masquerade as moral progress. The Queen's conduct grew into a centerpiece, judged against ideals she never agreed to inhabit. That rubric excused the machinery, since a serene ending implied a serene procedure. But serenity can be coached by exhaustion, not conviction, especially under surveillance and delay. The stage was ready, the props arranged, and the audience prepared for solemn closure. Bridge. Morning arrived with a careful speech, a still posture, and a kingdom holding its breath. Dawn filtered through narrow windows. Steps echoed. Officials measured their voices into formal calm. She walked with composure, shaped by days of practice, prayer, and unrelenting observation. What do final words accomplish when an audience expects formula more than revelation or relief? They settle the mood, frame the memory, and shield the living from immediate reprisals. She spoke without accusation, a choice historians debate, but understandable inside a punitive theater. A brief editorial note. Courage appears in many costumes, including restraint that protects those left behind. The stance followed French custom. The blade flashed once, witnesses exhaled and looked away. No gore was paraded. The ceremony prized cleanliness, dignity, and the calendar's implacable progress. Officials recorded serenity like evidence, attaching virtue to an outcome they had engineered by design. Near consequence unfolded instantly. Narratives hardened, praising humane procedure while ignoring the pipeline that produced it. Couriers rode with closure, churches murmured, embassies filed reports that balanced pity and approval. Markets steadied, grateful for certainty, while pamphlets rehearsed phrases that would outlive many participants. Memory began its work at noon, polishing edges, trimming doubts, and distributing approved adjectives. Yet approved adjectives do not answer the earlier questions about speed, counsel, and curated juries. Final scenes may soothe a crowd, but they cannot retrofit justice into the preceding days. The chamber emptied. The schedule continued. The building absorbed another story into polished stone. Bridge. Outside that chamber, the aftermath spoke through careless burial and the politics of forgetting. The crowd dispersed. Officials exhaled. A small cart rattled toward a chapel's shadow. Linen wrapped the remains with brisk competence, then slid into a box built for arrows. What does a burial without a name announce about a kingdom's conscience and its appetite for forgetting? Clerks preferred speed, not ceremony. The ledger gained a line while memory lost a marker. St. Peter ad vincula, absorbed another story quietly. Its stones practiced at hosting inconvenient conclusions. Friends were scarce by design. Mourning under surveillance teaches restraint and careful, deniable gestures. A measured aside belongs here. Anonymity is not neutrality, it is policy that edits posterity. The choice of container mattered because contempt thrives in details officials call merely practical. Pamphlets emphasized order, not tenderness, and praised thrift dressed as piety in closing paragraphs. Citizens learned which griefs were safe and which could be mistaken for sedition or stubbornness. The near consequence was predictable. Curiosity cooled, and the state's preferred narrative hardened into orthodoxy. Children would ask fewer questions when maps of graves omitted labels and stories trimmed edges. Markets moved on schedule, as if ledgers could bleach the meaning from a hurried burial. Yet unmarked ground rarely stays silent. It invites later pilgrims who read absence as indictment. A gentler order would have honored complexity, naming pain without endorsing the prosecution's theater. That gentleness was not on offer, so history inherited a hush louder than drums. Bridge. The hush followed a child who grew into a queen, shaping vows and signatures. A princess watched power break her mother, then watched power pretend the break was healing. Courtiers polished new loyalties while nursery walls learned the acoustics of cautious, rehearsed affection. How does a daughter's crown carry her mother's silence without repeating the machinery that made it? Elizabeth studied survival first, romance second, and invented armor that resembled wit, distance, and study. Advisors proposed matches like treaties, the queen weighed memory like evidence and declined the experiment repeatedly. Private tokens mattered, a tiny portrait ring, a legend of constancy, and careful curation of favorites. A calm aside helps here. Trauma translates into policy when rulers staff rooms to protect themselves. She delayed signatures on death warrants, demanding precision that bored hotheads and spared several trembling necks. That habit grew from early lessons. Speed flatters power, but accuracy protects people and reputation. The near consequence was strategic ambiguity. Suitors dangled, rivals stalled, and sovereignty gathered leverage without ceremony. Courtiers called it caprice. Diplomats called it prudence. Subjects called it peace more often than not. Governance became choreography again, yet this time the choreography stalled violence rather than accelerating it. Elizabeth's unmarried state signaled autonomy, announcing that treaties would be inked in council, not chapel. Her caution did not erase cruelty from England, but it slowed theater disguised as justice. That recalibration owed something to 17 days that taught a child the cost of velocity. Bridge. Elsewhere, the machinery repeated itself, proving that method, not monster, defined the age's courtroom tragedies. The machinery did not retire. It rehearsed new names and reached for familiar props. Catherine Howard entered history along a corridor already mapped by warrants, panels, and velvet solemnity. Can a system that rewards choreography ever resist staging the same performance with different actors? Investigations accelerated, counsel thinned, and gossip matured instantly into architecture that resembled proof. Courtiers recognized the cues, curated juries, practiced speeches, and a calendar that outpaced contradiction. A quiet editorial aside, precedent is a teacher, and bad precedent tutors swifter, cleaner injustices. What began as emergency hardened into method, and method returned as institutional self-confidence. Officials boasted of efficiency, mistaking repetition for reliability and theater for the rule of law. Citizens learned to anticipate endings, an education that hollows civic courage and fatigues compassion. The near consequence was bleakly practical. Innocence became a scheduling problem, not a standard to defend. Ambassadors adjusted etiquette, sending condolences in language that praised order while declining real scrutiny. Ministers tallied stability like inventory, ignoring that fear stocked shelves faster than legitimacy ever can. The scaffold's smooth operation looked like competence to those far away from its shadow. Closer to the boards, competence resembled indifference, and indifference resembled cruelty wearing silk. If justice can be templated, it can be franchised, and franchising spreads quicker than reform. The pattern, once visible, warns readers to distrust neat endings that arrive right on time. Bridge. Beyond England, pens scratched judgments of their own, converting spectacle into reputational debt abroad. Verses traveled where couriers hesitated, a long French poem mapped grief into polished indictment. Continental envoys, notably Chapuis, framed the case as swiftness armored with insufficient performative evidence. How do foreign pens reshape a domestic verdict when diplomacy prefers compliments to confrontation? They praise mercy, then footnote misgivings, leaving readers to hear the discord beneath the chords. Henry's circle understood the danger. Suppression orders followed, chasing copies already nestled in portfolios. Reputation became a new battlefield where allies gauged marriages and treaties by a monarch's restraint. A brief editorial note. Legitimacy abroad depends on processes at home, not only outcomes or optics. Trade prefers boring governments, poets prefer tragic ones. Europe read both ledgers simultaneously. The near consequence was felt in salons and courts. England's firmness sounded increasingly like inflexibility. Prospective matches cooled, flattery grew cautious, and ambassadors packed thicker files of contingency plans. Merchants priced small frictions into contracts, fearing sudden purges might spill into tariffs and ports. Pamphleteers, emboldened by distance, treated 17 days as emblem, not anomaly, of Tudor judgment. Even sympathizers asked privately whether justice there could ever slow down enough to breathe. When allies doubt your courts, alliances inherit that doubt in each clause and whisper. The crown replied, with ceremony and promises, but ceremony cannot silence arithmetic or memory. Bridge. Arithmetic returns us to tempo, the weaponized speed that made defense impossible and doubt unfashionable. Tempo became policy. Schedules turned to instruments. Each sunrise narrowed the range of lawful options. Petitions require time, and counsel needs corridors. Both vanished when 17 days became the whole arena. Can justice breathe when the clock is trained to outrun scrutiny, pity, and second thoughts? Couriers moved faster than arguments. Rehearsed announcements arrived before witnesses could even be gathered. The imported executioner's early summons broadcast urgency, discouraging advocates from investing in slow, careful defenses. A brief editorial note: speed flatters authority because it converts doubt into disloyalty with minimal debate. Timetables did the silencing that censors feared, numbing bystanders with inevitable steps and polished reassurances. Records showed motion, not examination. Paperwork marched while contradiction tripped on locked doors and late notices. The near consequence was structural. Defense became theater of one, and intervention shrank into rumor and prayer. Governors praised efficiency, teaching subjects that outcomes mattered more than reasons, and reasons were private. Markets adjusted, embassies smiled politely, and citizens learned to whisper earlier and risk less. Once tempo rules, mercy must sprint. Mercy rarely wins sprints against procedure built for speed. This is how velocity becomes a weapon: quiet, respectable, and devastating to the art of fairness. Those 17 days did not merely hurry, they educated a generation about the cost of delay. The lesson echoed forward, making future pauses politically dangerous and future trials brisk by design. Bridge. With tempo enthroned, examine the deeper fright: methodical killing shaped by kinship, hierarchy, and consent. The horror was not a monster's whim, it was a system's confidence, practiced and precise. Kinsmen presided, colleagues complied, and courtiers performed duty while trimming doubts to ceremonial size. What protection remains when kinship sits on the bench and etiquette masks conflicts of interest? Elite consensus hardened like winter ice, clear on top, treacherous beneath, beautifully smooth to the eye. A candid aside helps. Institutions prefer stories that absolve themselves, especially when those stories travel well. Attendance became complicity. Silence became competence. Promotion followed those who learned the choreography quickly. Clerics prayed order over truth. Nobles lent signatures. Clerks supplied rhythm that soothed uneasy patrons. The near consequence was cultural. Citizens inferred that safety meant obedience, and courage meant private, deniable pity. Children learned to keep faces still. Servants learned to arrange rooms that discouraged questions. When killing becomes administrative, grief becomes a scheduling note, and honor becomes a line item. Reformers, faced with polished outcomes, struggled to name the crime without indicting everyone present. That struggle bred careful euphemisms, the linguistic armor that lets cruel habits survive polite decades. A wiser polity would separate kin from judgment and proximity from power before tempers rise. It would measure justice by resistance to pressure, not by elegance of ceremony or speed. Until then, systems will recruit good manners to escort bad verdicts safely to completion. Bridge. Count the cost now. Coins for a blade and compounded interest charged to public trust. The ledger shows £23 for a blade, an amount tidy enough for accountants. Receipts comfort treasuries because prices appear to translate pain into comprehensible arithmetic. What exactly does a kingdom purchase when it pays promptly for a quiet, foreign stroke? It buys optics, not absolution; closure, not clarity, and a rumor of mercy, not justice. Coins settle with clinks, yet debts of trust compound, unseen, across courts and generations. A careful aside helps. Real costs live in silence. Careers muted, archives doctored, classrooms cautious. We owe the dead more than ceremony. We owe methods that resist panic and performance. That means triaging sources, stating uncertainty, and protecting victims from voyeurism disguised as candor. Editors should mark confidence levels. Advocates should demand time. Officials should separate kin from benches. Near consequence is immediate. When stories are told responsibly, demagogues lose a favorite stage. Citizens learn to ask about counsel, clocks, and curated juries before admiring polished endings. Markets prefer that discipline too. Boring justice is cheaper than theatrical governance every fiscal year. The price of the sword was low because the work was high elsewhere in secret. If we count only coins, we misprice the damage and invite repetition with cleaner ledgers. A healthier memory would budget for doubt, mercy, and the slow dignity of proper inquiry. That budget is political courage, not silver, invested before crises teach lessons with iron. Bridge. Keep that reckoning in mind as we close, tallying near consequences and opening the door forward. 17 days moved like machinery, converting rooms of honor into instruments of managed despair. A commission set the destination. Confession supplied momentum. Curated peers delivered unanimity on schedule. A foreign sword offered elegance, and elegance rehearsed the illusion that gentleness equals justice. If decorum can perfume violence, what safeguards keep law from mistaking theater for truth? The chain matters, speed eroded counsel, optics eclipsed evidence, and reputation bled across Europe's salons. Near consequences persist today. Systems still prize velocity, and leaders still mistake certainty for competence. Ethical narration slows that drift, centering victims, naming uncertainty, and refusing spectacle in the grammar of care. It also trains citizens to demand boring, verifiable process before clapping for tidy conclusions. A wiser state separates kinship from judgment, ritual from proof, and mercy from scheduling convenience. It funds time for defense, audits incentives, and publishes the anatomy of procedural choices. Those habits lower temperature, disarm rumor, and make future panics harder to monetize or weaponize. They also honor the living, who inherit the debts unpaid by hurried, polished endings. The invitation ahead is practical. Bring forward other fast trials, then test them with this lens. Which clocks were weaponized, which panels curated, which mercies advertised, and which costs mispriced. If we measure carefully, legends shrink to size and reforms stop waiting on tragedies. Bridge to next episode. Another courtroom built for speed, new names, familiar choreography, and choices we can still improve.